booktv.org. And Book TV's coverage of the Miami Book Fair continues now with Miami Herald investigative reporter Julie K. Brown, who discusses her in-depth look into the Jeffrey Epstein criminal case. This program will get underway shortly.
And welcome to the 38th edition of the Miami Book Fair. And my name is Patrick Nellis. I work here at the college in the Center for Learning, and it's my pleasure to get us started for this evening. I have a couple of announcements. So one is that the book fair doesn't just end tonight. It carries on throughout the year. We've got events all over town and live streaming and so on. So stay in touch with the Miami Book Fair on the web. Furthermore, we need to acknowledge the hundreds of volunteers that make this event possible and our major sponsors without whom we could not run the book fair: the Knight Foundation, the Batchelor Foundation, the Meredith Ann Dasberg Foundation, the Green Family Foundation, Stephanie Anzin, and Spencer Stewart, T-Mobile, and many other sponsors. Oh, I also need to do this every time. Can we see a show of hands of the friends of the book fair? Great, and let's give yourselves a round of applause for being friends of the book fair. The book fair needs friends. Find out about the perks of joining us as a friend of the book fair. We have a table downstairs. I have a couple of announcements. One is please try to make your phone quiet so it doesn't interrupt. And we will take questions and answers towards the end of the presentation. We have a microphone in the middle of the room, and we'll ask you to line up, and one question per customer so that people can get an opportunity. Following the talk, the author, Julie Brown, will be at the author's signing desk on this floor, past the elevators. I'll be escorting her down there after the talk, and you can purchase her book at the table outside of the room. With this, I'm going to introduce our master of ceremonies for this evening, who's going to introduce the speaker. This is Maria Meyer. She's the interim executive director of the Women's Fund Miami-Dade. As 1 Billion Rising global coordinator for Miami, she's worked with activists across the U.S. to create the awareness and solidarity necessary to end the staggering statistics of gender violence. Maria is a member of the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force and Miami-Dade Human Trafficking Coalition.
So much. Good evening to all here present, whether virtually or in this auditorium. I'm Maria Meyer, very proudly representing your Women's Fund Miami-Dade and our mutual supporters of the book fair and of the Women's Fund from the Shepard Broad Foundation. Together tonight, we will focus here on power. Power of one writer's proverbial pen, the power of narcissism and unmitigated privilege, and the power of investigative journalism to focus a critical, magnifying lens, long and hard enough on the facts to spark the collective outrage necessary to leverage action. Miami Herald investigative journalist Julie K. Brown relentlessly pursued how Jeffrey Epstein's years-long engagement in exploitation and sex trafficking remained unchecked. For decades, he freely moved through high society and political circles, leaving more and more survivors in his wake. Perversion of justice shines a spotlight on these crimes and long-time avoidance of any real consequences, not legal, not financial, nor personal. It's a fascinating and in-depth look at a gross miscarriage of justice. As director of the Knight Foundation's journalism program, Karen Rundlet's philanthropic focus is on investing in new methods to advance excellence in journalism and civic media as a way to support informed local communities. And that is what is about to happen here. Please join me in welcoming her and author Julie K. Brown to the Miami Book Fair stage. Ladies.
Hi, Julie. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Let's get started by, Julie and I used to work together at the Miami Herald, but I'm not sure that everyone knows her very well, and also there's quite a bit in this book that I learned about her. So why don't we start by learning a little bit about you? So let's just start with, where are you from? How'd you grow up? How'd you end up in journalism?
Thank you all for coming, by the way. It's good to be back in person at the book fair. I grew up in a little tiny town outside of Philadelphia called Sellersville. And, my mother was a single mom with 3 children, and needless to say, we struggled quite a bit. And I think it instilled in me some of the things my mother went through as a single mom. I remember one time we came home and all the furniture was gone from our house because my mother couldn't pay a utility bill. So, just the, injustices that I felt that she suffered sort of instilled in me, I think at a young age, that I wanted to do something about it. So that's kind of led me into writing. Writing was an outlet for me when I was very young. And, the fact that, I would read, stories about great people and how they overcame obstacles in their lives. And I think that made me also want to write, stories about people like that, or to, in some way, make a difference in other people's lives.
So you started your career in Philadelphia, and what was that like? What were you writing about? What were you reporting on?
Well, I started actually in Hunterdon County. I worked for every small paper that you could ever imagine. I started really at the bottom, doing obituaries, which are actually very good training ground, actually, because you have to learn everything about a person and tell this story about them in a very respectful way. So I just really went up the ladder, and in the beginning, I couldn't support myself on journalism salary, and I worked as a waitress, sort of like actors do, starving actors. I was starving journalist. So I worked a couple of jobs just to kind of pay the rent. And, and then I finally got a big break when I was hired by the Philadelphia Daily News, which was a big metropolitan newspaper in Philadelphia, and, then moved to the big city.
And then you eventually ended up in South Florida.
Yeah.
And so you were an editor for a while, and you talk about that in the book, and then you eventually went back to reporting. Why don't you tell us about what it takes to be a reporter? How do you get your stories? You reported on prisons for a number of years.
Well, I did a lot of, I always felt like one of the ways that I could stay in this business was to make sure that I could do everything. I could learn a little bit about everything. And so I just tried to be very nimble, and just every time they asked me to do something, I said yes, because I figured I would be able to keep my job if I worked hard enough and just never argued. So at least in the beginning of my career, I didn't argue a lot, and I did everything I was told to do. That, of course, as I became more experienced, I started arguing more. But yeah, it was, I did, running after murder scenes in the worst neighborhoods of Philadelphia, going to fires in the middle of the night, car crashes. Probably almost everything I've done at one time or another. But I really liked the crime. I really kind of got a niche with covering crime. And then from crime, I realized, that the police didn't always do a good job of investigating, and so I realized that I could find out things that the police didn't even know, and that's when I got the bug to do more investigative work.
So again, you had been covering women's prisons and done really exceptional work, but you were looking for something else. And how did you really find this story? What is it that you first saw that made you really want to go deeper? What shocked you?
Well, this was an old story. Contrary to what some people often say, I didn't break the Jeffrey Epstein story. This had happened a decade before I took it up, and it did get a lot of coverage in certain places, particularly in Palm Beach at the time that it happened originally. But it didn't get much traction nationally, and I think it kind of dropped off the radar after everybody just kind of concluded that Jeffrey Epstein got off or got this very lenient sentence because he was very wealthy, and that's just the way our system works. And I felt that, you know, that's not a good enough reason. You know, I felt like there was more to it. I always suspected that there was some kind of corruption involved in it. And then when Donald Trump was nominated, when Donald Trump was running for president, a woman had filed a lawsuit against him and Jeffrey Epstein claiming that he had sexually assaulted her along with Jeffrey Epstein as well. So, you know, there was an article that I read in a newspaper where they were sort of taking the mainstream media to task for not looking into this whole story about Epstein and Trump and this woman. And I had already known about the case, and I thought, this does seem weird. Maybe I should take a look. So as I was sort of starting to pick away at looking at the case, Trump got elected, and then he nominated Alex Acosta as labor secretary. And I knew that Alex Acosta was the person who had signed off on this sweetheart plea deal that Epstein received. So I thought at the time, like, I wonder what these victims who were young, 13, 14 years old at the time, now they're in their late 20s, I wonder what they think about the fact that the man that pretty much let their predator off the hook was now in charge of a large agency with oversight on human trafficking and child labor laws. So my initial goal was just to try to see if the victims would finally come forward and talk to me. But as I started digging more and more into the story, I found so much more. There was so much more to the story, the victims, how they were treated, but also how Epstein managed to manipulate just about every part of this case. And the prosecutors kind of looked the other way as he was doing it, or relented continually and let him get away with it.
The thing about the reporting is it really looked at the entire system, and you talked a lot, you speak about that a lot, you wrote about that a lot in the book. Just the different, he would hire attorneys that were married to other attorneys, and so then somebody would be eliminated. There was conflict of interest. So tell me a little bit about the process. Investigative reporting, there's a mystery around it, and there's also, you spend time digging into records, and it doesn't necessarily turn something up, or sometimes you go down too many rabbit holes. Why don't we get into the process of the work that you did?
Well, no one just wakes up one day and decides to be an investigative reporter. There are a lot of reporters that don't like doing investigative work. There's a lot of reporters that do great journalism in a certain, like, business journalism or aspects of, journalism that I couldn't do, And somehow, you have to, I think the thing that led me to do investigative journalism is because I just always wanted to get to the truth, And I felt like there was so much going on in our country and in society where I thought sometimes we just really don't know how this happened, like how this particular person ended up in this particular place. And that always fascinated me. And often when I looked into it, there was always a story, and that's what we do, even though it's a lot of digging. It's also about telling stories because that's what makes people interested. So you have to, your work is kind of twofold in that you have to, dig through these dense, horribly boring documents, that are written by people like lawyers, and it's the last thing, sorry, lawyers.
Any lawyers here?
Sorry,
Maybe?
lawyers. But you got to kind of make sense out of it. And, it isn't really easy to do that. And in this particular case, there was tens of thousands of documents, that had been filed over the years because after the criminal case ended, there were all these civil lawsuits that were filed. So, like a dozen civil lawsuits, and, each one of them had 200 docket entries, in the system. So I realized, at first I thought, when I did it, I thought I could do what I always do, which is usually what a reporter does is they take the motion for summary judgment, the complaint, the motion for summary judgment, the key documents that where they're laying out their case, and then you can write a story off of that. But I quickly realized that it wasn't going to work in this case because I would read something for example, in the motion for summary judgment, and I'm like, what? Where'd they get that? And then I thought, I've got to, and then I go to that document, and then that document I would be like, there's no way. I was sort of cherry picking documents. I said, I've got to sit down and I've got to read every single thing, because by doing that, I was able to take the story apart and put it back together in a way I think that other people hadn't been able to do.
So how long did that take you?
It took me a good year and a half.
To read all those documents, and there were documents that you couldn't get access to that you needed the Herald to help you get.
Right. Fortunately, I should have mentioned the Herald a lot sooner, because I couldn't have really done this without the support of the Herald, especially since investigative reporting, by the way, is the most costly thing that a newspaper does. Imagine, one of the ways, for example, that people get around giving you public documents is by charging a lot for them. So you'll say, I want this investigation, I want a copy of it, and they'll say, well, it's $5,000, and then you got to negotiate with them, and maybe you only get half of it, or you only get the first 10 pages, or you only get the summary. But it is very expensive to do investigative work, and that's why you should buy newspapers, because you're only paying, I don't know what it is now, I pay $10 a month for the online version, but, buying these documents that we buy that you would never otherwise have access to is part of what goes into the price of the newspaper.
That's actually in your Twitter bio. You said real journalism costs money. Please buy a newspaper. So, there are really highs and lows. There are times where you're digging deep and you're not finding things, and there are times where there are just some highs. So, tell me, in the reporting process, in this year and a half, what was a moment that was a big win and you knew you were able to advance this? And what was a moment that was really difficult?
Well, the most challenging part of this case was finding the victims, because, now they were in their late 20s. Some of them had gotten married, others had gone to jail. There was, they were, first of all their names were redacted from the documents because they were minors. So how do you find out who these women even are? So, what I learned, with all the experience that I had by this point was that inevitably when you get these files that are redacted, they forget to redact things. So, you might get a first name accidentally unredacted here, or a birth date. And I just put together a big spreadsheet with everything I knew about each of the victims. And when it was all said and done, I had a list of 60 women. And then you have to try to contact them. And so that was probably the biggest challenge that I had, and that took a long time, finding them. And in the process of doing that, in order to find them, I had to find out a little bit about them. And I recognized a pattern with these young women, that their lives had been dramatically altered by what had happened to them, the abuse that they suffered. A lot of them had fallen into drug addiction, or had ended up in jail. Some of them were victims of domestic, abuse. So I could see right away that this was, that these victims really suffered an awful lot of pain in the years that followed. So the story just kind of morphed into originally going to be just a reaction to Acosta being nominated and his victims saying what they thought about it, to me realizing that this was a total, utter failure on the part of the criminal justice system in a horrible way. And so, and then, you have to kind of talk your editor into letting you do more and to pay more money.
And that was a breeze, right? It was easy. Your editor just said yes to everything, I'm sure.
Yeah. Just do it these 5 stories first, you know. So yeah, it's you know, I was covering a hurricane in the middle of this. We had there was quite a Parkland happened in the middle of this, and of course we dropped everything, and you know, I was up there doing stories in Parkland. So you know, you don't just, you know, stop doing all the other work that we have to do. And I like doing that. I like going back and forth, actually. I think it gives you a fresh perspective when you kind of break away for a little while and then go back to it, and then you realize, oh my gosh, I still have so much work to do. So.
And you worked with a partner. You worked with Emily Michaud.
Yes, Emily. I think Emily is here somewhere. Oh, yes. There she is. Yes, I could not have done this without Emily. She's kind of my guiding force because I could go off the rails sometimes. So, yes. And, you know, her work on the visual part of this, we did a number of documentaries that accompanied the series, which were interviews with the victims. And they, in my view, were really the most powerful part of the whole entire project, because this was, you know, I say now because the story is now an international story and every journalist in the world is practically on this story, but, and I say this all the time to Emily, no one will ever capture the rawness that Emily captured, and I'm getting chills just thinking about it, because nobody had cared about what those girls thought before we met them. And you know, to be there when they were talking about it for the first time in a decade, and the emotions that poured out of them, nobody's ever going to capture that the way that Emily did. And so I would encourage anybody to go online and see the documentaries, because they were really a very, very, if not the most important part of the project. And, you know, when you said, what was the moment when you knew? The moment that we knew was when we interviewed the first victim. And I still get teary every time I talk about it, because it was just a moment that we knew we had such a good and important story. And we just knew, you know, that was a big breakthrough.
So the story was published.
Sorry.
Take a moment.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So the story was published November 28th, 2018. Mm-hmm. It's November 21st today, so...
Yeah, 3 years, almost 3 years ago, yeah.
3 years ago. And at this point, 3 years ago, you were being lawyered, those lawyers again. Lawyers are reviewing everything, including the videos, the documentary videos that Emily worked on with you. And what's happening? There's something happened on Thanksgiving Day.
Well, Emily was making pies, because we just talked about this, because we're almost Thanksgiving. I said, are you going to be making pies with her family? And the lawyers were working on it over the holiday, because it was supposed to run that next weekend. And they called her and told her she had to rework one of the whole videos. So she had to drop everything, and she went and she reworked the whole thing like a trooper. Of course, she called me screaming and yelling, but yeah, it's just what we do, you know. It's just very challenging work, but it's very important work. And I think if you keep your eye on what the goal is, you kind of push through it, you know, all the challenges, all the arguments with the editors, and, you know, the resources, the lack of resources, the fact that they don't want to, you know, pay for this or pay for that. And it's hard sometimes, but you just deal with it, you know, like a professional.
So I would love for you to read from the book exactly what happened on the day that you published. I know that you were hoping that it would be a splash for a day if you were lucky. So I would love it if you would read that section, page 276. Okay. The story was published online, and
yeah, they put the whole series out online right away on, I think it was a Thursday. And I went in real early that morning because I knew it was going to launch and we were going to do a lot of social media on it. And, you know, you're exhausted. I was absolutely exhausted because, you know, we had been editing it for weeks and working on the video. And you just, at the point where you just want it to be all over. I want this to be done. I want to go home and go to bed. So that the launch time for the online version of the story kept changing, but we finally landed on November 28th at 7 a.m. I went home that night and tossed in bed, unable to sleep. I finally gave up and got up about 4 a.m. I headed to the gym at 5 and climbed on the elliptical trainer. I remember praying the entire time I was on the machine that my story would at least last one day online before being forgotten. I went home, showered, threw on jeans and a t-shirt, and drove to the Herald newsroom just after dawn. I stopped and bought $60 worth of bagels and coffee for the crew that morning, hoping I had enough money in my bank account to cover the expense. When I walked into the newsroom, I looked at the large digital screen in the center of the room that lists the Herald's most read stories that morning. At the top of the list was a story about a woman who had farted in a dollar store. The headline was, "Woman passes gas in store, then pulls knife." It was getting thousands of hits. I almost never paid attention to the stories at the top of the board. They were often clickbait that we and other newspapers used to lure our readers to the other more serious journalism on our website. At about 8 a.m., the 3 parts of the series, along with the massive graphic, all the videos, a timeline, and a piece called How We Got the Story, were launched under the headline, "How a Future Trump Cabinet Member Gave a Serial Sex Abuser the Deal of a Lifetime." I began tweeting out the stories. I hardly had any followers on Twitter, so it was a short task. Our 2 social media talents, Noel Gonzalez and Adrian Rui, were busy blitzing the stories across the internet universe. I had a bagel and watched the board with my stories at the very bottom of the list, then began packing up with the intention of going home to sleep. I was relieved my work was done. The newsroom was starting to get busy as more staff arrived for work. Suddenly, reporter Renee Rodriguez shouted over, "Have you seen the board?" I walked over, and my stories, all 3 of them, were climbing fast. The first one had thousands of hits. "Well, it's never going to top that fart story," I said, walking back to my desk. Before turning off my computer, I looked at my Twitter account. I suddenly had thousands of followers. Then the unbelievable happened. It beat the fart story. The room erupted in applause. My phone started ringing, and my computer mailbox was filling up with congratulations. The first call I took was from Mike Ryder, which I always mispronounce his name, Ryder. He was more than elated. Finally, he said, someone had put together the Epstein story in a way that would make people understand the scope of his crimes, and worse, how prosecutors helped Epstein get away with them. Ryder's words meant the world to me. That's it.
So have you seen Alex Acosta at all lately?
No.
Have you?
No,
not at all.
No, not at all.
Not at all.
I don't think anybody has seen him, actually.
Yeah.
So I haven't had any sightings, let's put it that way.
So, look, this story, it has connections to 2 former presidents. It has connections to a prince. It has prestigious attorneys all over it. And coming up next week, after Thanksgiving, there will be another trial. There is a chapter in here. There is a chapter in the book about how this ended for Jeffrey Epstein. And I know that's something people always want to know from you. What do you think happened? So what do you think happened?
Well, I don't think he committed suicide. I know a lot of people disagree with that, but I covered prisons for a long time, and I know the way that corruption happens. And this was a textbook case of, a suspicious death. And there were just too many holes in the whole story. I mean, he had just come off a suicide watch. They took the guy who was a cellmate out just hours before this allegedly happened. You didn't just have one guard fall asleep, you had two guards fall asleep. The cameras weren't working. They take the body, remove the body without even taking photographs. I mean, the whole thing just, it just doesn't make any sense. Coupled with the fact that Epstein was the kind of person that believed he was above the law. He really had gotten away with this the first time. And this was an old case. He conceivably could claim that, these charges were based on the plea bargain that he had agreed to with federal prosecutors in Florida, and therefore the charges were already disposed of. And he was only in prison for like a month when he allegedly committed suicide. He was hiring lawyers up until that week. He was hiring new lawyers. So the whole thing just doesn't make sense that he would have done it to begin with. But not only that, but done it by his own hand, which this was a man that didn't do anything on his own. He had, people practically tying his own shoelaces, And for him to break 3 bones, not 1 bone, but 3 bones in his neck, and do it by somehow leaning forward, by tying something to the top bunk, and he would do that. It's just unfathomable to me that it happened that way. Now, do I think that it's possible if he wanted to do himself in, he probably would have hired somebody to do it. He wouldn't have done it, and I just don't think he was capable of doing it on his own.
So will you be covering the trial that's upcoming for Ghislaine Maxwell?
Yeah, I'm
yes,
going.
You will?
Yeah.
Okay. We are going to open it up to folks for questions as well. So if you have questions, how are you preparing for that? How are you preparing to report on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This is going to be a real challenge because it's going to be a media circus, and here's a real funny thing. I can't get press credentials for this trial. I can't get them. Yeah. They won't give me press credentials. She probably wouldn't be trying. She wouldn't be in jail right now if it wasn't for me. But I can't get credentials because I'm not a New York journalist. So you have to be like a New York journalist to get credentials in the courthouse. So I'm just praying that I'll be able to get in the courtroom and, hope for the best,
And please, if anyone does want to ask questions, we have a mic. Oh, hello. Yeah, why don't you go to the mic?
So if you can line up in the middle, and behind the mic, we'll go one person at a time.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much. I'm very inspired by all your hard work. And my question is, were you afraid of any threats of retaliation? And is there anything that ever happened as a result of it?
I'm never afraid. Emily is the one that kind of makes me worry because she's the one that she's the voice of reason in our team because I just don't think about it until it's pointed out to me. Like I would always tell people, no, I wasn't worried, but now that you bring it up, now I'm worried. You can't, when I was covering the prisons, I was far more worried about my safety than I was with this case. I was able to essentially do this story under the radar. Jeffrey Epstein had no idea what he was confronting. He really didn't know. I mean, we contacted him, but I think he just thought, this is just some little reporter from the Miami Herald, and what's she going to get that nobody else hasn't already gotten? So, I think that worked in my favor, that I worked for a small local, not really small, but a regional newspaper and not the New York Times. If it was the New York Times knocking on his door as much as I did, he probably would have paid closer attention, to be honest with you. So, no, I didn't really worry until after the series ran, and then we had a couple of suspicious things happen, which you'll have to get my book, and you'll have to read it in my book.
Thank you.
Hi, Julie. Since you believe, and so did the guy who destroyed the painting at Basel last year, that he didn't commit suicide, are you gonna track and see what happens? See if you can find out who.
You know what? I don't know how much of my life should I dedicate to this story. You know, there's so many other stories. You know, in my mind, this story was one that people, that had been forgotten, and that there was still some justice to be done. And I don't know, I kind of tend to think that my job with this story is almost over, and that I need to find another story like this one that that people aren't paying attention to, I think, it's been like 3 years, 4.5 since I took it up. So I kind of think that maybe it's time for me to let other people take up that. We'll be talking about this like the JFK assassination. There will be documentaries going on well after we're all gone about who killed Jeffrey Epstein. That's my thought.
Okay, thank you.
My basic question is, do you think that Jeffrey Epstein was blackmailing Leslie Wexner, who's the head of the Limited? And how did Epstein push out Harold Levin, the former money manager for Wexner?
When I did this series, I had to, there were so many angles to this case. All the powerful people that he knew, and, how did he get his money? And, there was just all these rabbit holes that I could have, jumped down. And I had to, at some point, sort of define the story and do, a certain piece of it, because there was no way I could do it all. And so I didn't really look into that part of it, to be honest with you. I mean, now we know a lot more about that, all his connections and all the people that he probably had the goods on, so to speak. And certainly Wexner is in that category. Wexner has already been on the record as saying that Epstein stole millions of dollars from him. He never reported it. Why do you not report it? You don't report it because Epstein has something on you, and it's what he has is far more damaging than the whatever it is, the 50 million that he stole from me. So Epstein also was very good at making people feel that he had something on them, or that he had connections. I don't know how deep his connections were to some of these people, but because he had, or he talked about it, or he had photographs of him with all these people, and all these people allowed themselves to be with him, it gave him some credibility that he probably wouldn't otherwise have had if he was just a regular multimillionaire. But he used these people to some degree to give himself, leverage over even more important people. So he was a good con man. So it's hard to know how much how much dirt he really had versus how much he led people to believe that he had.
Okay.
Julie, first, I just want to thank you for being such an inspiration to young journalists. Shorter than the guy before me. You are truly an inspiration. And my question for you, the part of the book that I just love so much was, the challenges of being an investigative reporter. Here you have this amazing story, and still you're pulling teeth to get the article written. So in light of where we are today with newspapers, do you have thoughts on structural changes or foundational changes in the news business that could help save newspapers, large and small, throughout the country?
Oh gosh, if I knew the solution to that, man, I'd probably win a Pulitzer Prize for that. It is such a tough battle because our attention is just focused so many other places now with the internet and social media and everything. It is absolutely crazy. I don't know really what the answer is. The only thing I can say is I think people still want to read good stories and good journalism. And I don't think that'll ever go away. You still need the content. You might get the headline by turning on your TV, but you're really not going to get a good story out of it. And of course, all of you are here because you're readers. So you probably, I'm preaching to the choir here. You probably all understand all that. But there's a whole another part of our world of people that just don't, they don't read. They really don't. They just turn on TV, and they hear something from Sean Hannity, and they think that that's all based on fact and that's all a story. Or, Anderson Cooper, whoever your persuasion is. But it goes both ways. I mean, this is a world where I think our education system really has to do a better job. I think that that's where it starts, with our education system. And
thank you. Thanks. Hello.
Hi.
I dabbled with the Herald a few years back, so it's nice to see another reporter. So, I'm out of curiosity, have you ever seen any of the versions of the Epstein story that have been adapted into popular television shows, like, say, Law and Order's version of it? And what your opinion of theirs is?
No. I've never seen it. I don't really watch a whole lot of TV. I really, I have to force myself sometimes to watch certain things that are news related because I know that I should watch them, but I'm just not a good TV watcher. I think I have a short attention span.
Hi, Julie.
Hi.
Thank you. Hope there's no one else. I wanted to ask about how you navigated the controversy of the story, and in particular the fact that there are a lot of conspiratorial theories going around about it, because it seems like discussing whether or not Epstein killed himself is sometimes equated with discussing whether or not he was a government agent or discussing whether or not the Clintons did it or anything like that. So how do you navigate that kind of controversy, and how are you able to pursue the right sources when there are so many competing theories out there?
Well, I think it's important to, whenever you do a story as a journalist, you have to make sure that you have some facts to back it up. And so when some of these stories come up, one of the, these conspiracy theories, you just go to people like an expert that knows about the bones in the neck. Like I interviewed Michael Baden, who I have a lot of respect for. He's a really well-known forensic pathologist, and he was present at Epstein's autopsy. And I've worked with him for years on the deaths that I covered in the prison system. And he explained in very clear detail about why he didn't feel Epstein committed suicide. So, and I have a lot, like I said, and also I have a lot of experience covering crimes, and just common sense things didn't happen in this case that would happen. You have to treat this as a potential crime scene from the very beginning, because you can't go back and collect the evidence after it's all gone, and they didn't do that. And I know that these officers in this system are trained to do that, and so, I guess really the short answer to this is that you have to use real experts and real facts. I don't think you should ignore conspiracy theories, but once you find like 2 problems wrong with it, you can pretty much figure that it's not true.
Thank you.
I just really wanted to add there, Julie really does spend a lot of time in the book talking about all the work that goes into this, all the records. We talked about it during this conversation. There are theories and there is deep reporting that is backed up, and then lawyers review everything before this is published. And, Julie and I talked a lot about, and it's very much in the book, how many people don't understand the process and what these stories go through to even get published.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I really didn't set out to write a book about journalism or about me, especially not me, but my editor kept saying, like I would write something and she would say, well, but how did you do that? I'm like, I don't know, I just did it. Well, you need to explain how you did that. And so, you don't think as a journalist how you do something, you kind of just do it. I guess all of you probably have careers or jobs where if somebody right now told you, how do you do that? Explain to me every detail. You probably couldn't do it right away. You probably would really have to think about it. And as I started thinking about it and adding some of that in the book, it occurred to me that a lot of people don't understand the work that goes into investigative journalism and the sacrifices that you really make, in time and in money and in, so I thought in a way that maybe it would be good to get that into the public eye so that they understood, just the struggle.
Thank you so much for your work with this book and your courage and your persistence. I'm sure it took a lot of that. And, the conspiracy and just this creature that was Jeffrey Epstein and whether or not he took his own life, I feel like a bigger story is even the perversion of justice.
Right.
And I'm curious to know if there's any way of taking it forward, so it's not just another slap on the hand, but policy change or what might happen from here.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked it because that was the whole reason, really, why I did this story, because I didn't think that the coverage of this case did enough to explain the broken system of justice we have in this country. And I think I just was actually in an interview right before this where I was asked a similar question, and my answer was, I'm hopeful that, the younger generation of people in our system, police officers, lawyers, prosecutors, FBI agents, understand how our system has been broken for so long and work on fixing it. I'm hopeful that that a younger generation will do more. Now that we know, we have so much more information, cameras are out there everywhere. We know now about the level of police brutality, particularly involving people who are of color, people who are poor. We now know that, there was a long time ago when I started in journalism that whatever a police officer said, you would just take as gospel and you would write it. Now we don't do that as much anymore. We know that it's not always the way it happened. So we'll go out and we will now interview other witnesses and we will get different stories. So I think that has come because our society is changing. We're starting to finally understand that we need to do a lot to fix our criminal justice system and make it fairer and make it more just for everybody. Because these girls were poor girls. I mean, one of them told me, the reason why Jeffrey Epstein picked somebody that he thought nobody would listen to, and he was right. He picked these girls because he felt nobody would believe them. And, and that's part of what is going on in our country, and we have to, I hope, that it changes and that our younger generation will, look at things differently.
Can you talk about his surveillance system, how extensive it was, what he had on it, and what you think happened to it?
Well, he had cameras in he had a whole room in his New York mansion of cameras. And as I understand it from people who were there, he had cameras almost in every room. And there's been an awful lot of speculation about what would have happened to that film. Now, remember, when this crime first happened in 2005, 2006, technology was not what it is today. So whatever kind of footage he probably had from back then, God knows what kind of shape it was in. I mean, I've had quite a few people come to me with, here's this, claiming that they had Jeffrey Epstein video footage, and it's so grainy that there's no way you could tell who's in the footage. So, we really don't know if he really had any. Even if he was taping people, we don't know if the footage exists still or it's even usable. So it's hard to know exactly what kind of condition that stuff would be in. And certainly, if it existed, the FBI has it. And my feeling is if they did get anything like that, they're going to bury it and it's not going to come out.
So, we have time for one more question. One more question.
Okay. I've found in my reporting that sometimes the line blurs between being a journalist and almost a therapist to your source. And I can imagine that being especially true with these girls or these women now, who'd been so traumatized when they were young and no one had ever believed them. How did you win their trust? How did you approach them as subjects for this reporting?
Well, I did some homework beforehand because I knew that this had a good chance of re-traumatizing them, and I didn't want to do that. I had a lot of experience interviewing crime victims, and I had even interviewed rape victims before, but these were victims who had been abused when they were very young. And so I interviewed, people who work with those kinds of trauma victims to try to get a handle on how best to approach it. I think ultimately what Emily and I did was we just let them talk. We didn't really, well, what happened next? Tell me that, tell me that. We didn't have to, because once they started talking, it just spilled right out. They had been waiting too long to tell that story. And, I described the first victim who I got teary about before, and that interview was incredibly, it was so emotional and powerful. And I just swallowed my pain, that you see in me now. I just you swallow it when you don't, show emotions. You should just keep going. And it wasn't until I got in the car and she called me and thanked me that I cried. I broke down, because I knew that we had such a responsibility to tell this story in a respectful way. I felt a lot of pressure at that moment, and hoped, just hoped that I would do them justice,
Julie, I think it would be really great if you just closed reading from the preface, page 14.
The Jeffrey Epstein story epitomizes our nation's lopsided system of justice and how victims of sexual assault, especially those who are young and poor, are discarded, shamed, and mistreated by the very people who are supposed to protect them. Epstein got away with his crimes because nearly every element of society allowed him to get away with them. Professional, legal, and moral ethics were set aside for a broken system of values that places corporate profits, personal wealth, political connections, and celebrity above some of the most sacred tenets of our faiths, our teachings, and our democracy. When I became a journalist, I learned that the most rewarding part of my work was in writing injustices for those who could not fight for themselves. Few people seem to recognize that Epstein not only beat the system, but he was probably still hunting, terrorizing, and abusing young women and girls. I would face many obstacles on my path to the truth. I would be attacked by the legal forces who failed their solemn oaths, by the defense attorneys who profited off of Epstein's crimes, and by some of those within my own industry who thought that what I was doing was nothing more than a rehash of an old story. In my lifetime, there has never been a more urgent need for journalism or a more important time to play a role in giving voice to those who have none. I believe that at this moment in history, when world events test our resilience, and when propaganda, conspiracies, and lies threaten to undermine all that our nation holds dear, it will be journalists who hold the corrupt and powerful to account. As journalists, we cannot put aside this important mission, even if we think the story has already been told, because this was one story that wasn't finished.
So thank you, Julie and Karen, and good night.
And that wraps up our coverage of the Miami Book Fair. You can watch all of today's programs at any time by visiting our website, booktv.org, and clicking the Book Fairs and Festivals tab.
Weekends on C-SPAN 2 are an intellectual feast. Every Saturday,